Okay. Well, Madeline raised a question last week about a timeline, so I try to put something together that might be useful. And it really is important for understanding what went wrong with Vietnam. Where did America go wrong? Because this timeline, they never dealt with this. And we're going to talk about it. And anyway, so in 1858, you have the French invasion, colonialism, invasion. Mind you, when we get into the arguments about what's wrong with communism and socialism and all of that, what is it that how do we depict, the communists and all of that? They'll invade, you'll become enslaved. All the things that were, ascribed to communists were exactly the things that were done by the colonialists when they invaded. Ho Chi Minh is born in 1890. He leaves Vietnam around 1911, travels to France, to the US and other places. In 1919, he attempts to meet with Woodrow Wilson in Versailles. In 1930, he formed the Vietnamese Communist Party. Because remember, the communists don't really get a footing until the end of World War I with the Russian Revolution. And it's really debatable as to what really are the specifications of communism and what did Lenin actually bring to that? Did he really implement a communist system as Marx might have defined it? Anyway, so he forms the Communist Party. 1941, he forms the Viet Minh to fight the French. And mind you, now France has lost to Germany. The Japanese are given authority over the French, but the French are allowed to continue administering Vietnam. And then 1945, shortly before the end of the war, the Japanese push the French out of the way and they take control. They really are looking to take Vietnam's rice and food sources to feed Japanese at that point. And so we get to and the Viet Minh have, not just in 1945, but before then, have been aiding America in the fight against the Japanese and also against the French. In 1945, Japan surrenders. The French want control back. The Allied powers, however, call for a pause. They assign England to administer the south of Vietnam, and China, who was an allied power of the Allies, with America and Russia and the others, to administer the north. And so when that happens, you have the French, the British, the Chinese, and the Vietnamese competing for power immediately at the end of the war. And so when the Allied powers finally get around to saying, all right, now let's deal with Vietnam, France is pushing to reassert control. And what they come to is an agreement. Ho agrees to allow the French to come back in and assert control with the condition that the British and the Chinese are pushed out, which they are. And the idea is that within 2 years, the French will give the Vietnamese their independence. However, what they're saying is that we're going to do that within a French union, which is really smoke and mirrors, saying you're going to be independent under our control. So it's at this point that Lý Doan is starting to assert power because Ho Chi Minh is losing power because of his accommodations. at this point. And the French assigned Bao Dai as the leader of the South as they attempt to give the Vietnamese this independence in a French union. Then comes 1954. The Vietnamese, the Viet Minh decide they're going to attack, and they defeat the French, China and Russia. Mind you, again, in our mind, the Vietnamese were merely puppets for the Russians and the Chinese. This was a proxy war trying to spread communism. So if the Viet Minh now defeat the French, this means communism has won, and the French and the Russians and the Chinese should be dancing in the street. Instead, the Russians and the Chinese are pressuring the Viet Minh to go to Geneva for a peace conference, so that they can't just say, okay, we won, we're now in control. They're going to have to wait 2 more years so there can be an election. And they separate North Vietnam, South Vietnam again, and they assign the French control in the South and Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh control in the North. And so it's just, I mean, the facts of the matter contradict what was the paradigm, the narrative that we continued to hold on to. Bao Dai walks away in 1955, allowing Diem to come to power. He is an anti-communist and he wants independence, but he's very cautious about being too close with the Americans. And the French are there still with Diem in power. America comes along and we're providing all the financial assistance to the French to keep them in power, and to Diem. Finally, we decide we don't need the French anymore, and the French want out. So that puts us in the position where we become advisors, and it now becomes America's war. In 1960, the Viet Minh control the countryside, not only in the north, but also in the south. In 63, Diem is killed. Then a string of military coups d'etats take place with different leaders taking over and replacing others. And by that time, by 63, the Viet Minh have a shadow government that is governing 80% of the country. In 63, JFK is killed. LBJ introduces troops in 65. The Vietnamese finally win in 1975. So that's just kind of a timeline that hopefully will be a little bit helpful. Let me get this next one up. There we go. Slide. No, that's not the one I want. That's not the one I want. Okay. Share that. Okay. Okay. World Wars I and II represent a historic insult to the human experience. Think about that. World Wars I and II are an insult to the overall history of the human existence. It is something like the meteor that killed off the dinosaurs, right? I mean, we have hundreds of millions of people have died. We have official count, but it really, the death toll keeps rising after what we establish as the official death toll. So the world was basically butchering itself. By 1950, the world was still recovering. Eastern Europe would not recover until the turn of the century. Europe and Asia were in rubble. The population of the world was in shock. Surviving soldiers healed their physical wounds and used copious amounts of alcohol in treating their mental wounds. That's all the soldiers, Russian, German, American, English. The alcohol problems throughout Europe after the war are monumental. The war was over, perhaps, but a dark cloud continued to hang over the human experience. Fears of a new war infected world leadership. Capitalist world powers feared a resurgence of communism. Indeed, after World War I, it was fear of communism that drove supporters of Hitler. A modified version of communism post-World War II, known as social democracy, gained favor across Western Europe as it appeared focused on problem solving and not ideology. Meanwhile, in Asia, America's ally, remember, many people forget that China was one of the allies in the fight in World War II. America's ally, Chiang Kai-shek of China, was struggling to hold the country together as Mao marched his troops in a civil war designed for communists to take control of China. Management of the post-war was as daunting as managing the war itself. American industry fine-tuned manufacturing processes during the war, but came away from the war fearful of government interference in the free market. They mounted strenuous campaigns against communism and government interference. This agitation helped fuel tensions with America's Russian ally and provided a political tool for political opportunists in stoking fears of communism. It is important to note that Joseph Stalin gave credibility to communist fears as he ruled with an iron fist. His harsh brutality became the face of communism. As an autocratic military dictator, it may be argued that Stalin was far removed from the ideas of communism. By 1950, the Cold War was underway. Russia developed an atomic bomb. Korea was about to erupt, and a civil war in Greece was winding down. The colonized world demanded independence, but colonialists wanted their colonies returned, driving the colonized world into the arms of the communists. The 1950s remained in deep, deep turmoil.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia had the atom secret caused State Departments all over the world to stir uneasily.
We were very aware that there was a Cold War, and that we had an enemy, and that enemy was the Soviet Union. The United States stood at one pole, and the Soviet Union stood at the other pole. It was kind of a Manichaean dynamic that there was evil and there was good, and we were good, and the other side was evil. It wasn't morally ambiguous.
Just a few weeks after Russia became a nuclear power, there was more stunning news. Communist forces under Mao Zedong seized control of China. Separate communist insurrections were also underway in the British colonies of Burma and Malaya. In January 1950, Mao formally recognized Ho Chi Minh's insurgency and agreed to provide the arms, equipment, and military training he had been seeking. The Soviets recognized the Viet Minh as well and also offered help. President Truman, who was being blamed by his political opponents for having lost China and having failed to contain communism, approved a $23 million aid program for the French in Vietnam. The United States was no longer neutral.
We were caught on the horns of a dilemma of how can we maintain our friendship and our alliance with the French and support them in Indochina while we as a former colony ourselves sympathize with the Vietnamese and their aspirations for freedom and independence.
A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders.
In June of 1950, China's ally, Communist North Korea, invaded South Korea. President Truman ordered tens of thousands of American ground troops onto the Korean peninsula. The United States and its allies eventually pushed the invaders back north. Meanwhile, in southern China, Mao's military was beginning to turn the Viet Minh into a modern fighting force, capable of inflicting a heavy toll on the French occupiers. In July, the Truman administration quietly dispatched transport planes and a shipload of jeeps to Vietnam. 35 military advisors went along to oversee their use. None of them, and no one in the American embassy, spoke a word of Vietnamese. But the United States was now officially in Vietnam. In October of 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops began pouring into North Korea, driving the Allies back down the peninsula. As that fighting raged, Truman continued to increase military aid for the French war in Vietnam.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
And so what happens is we have FDR has said he doesn't want the American military to provide any assistance to the French in their effort to try to reestablish colonial rule in Vietnam. But FDR dies, Harry Truman comes into office, and Truman is not privy to what the thinking was of FDR, but he's also straddling the line between, am I fighting communist or am I opposed to the colonial return of colonial powers? So he's really having a difficult time with that. Korea breaks out into war, and that is what pushes Harry to start giving support to the French in the fight against communism. It's very important to see how these things, I mentioned to you before, framing the argument is the means for manipulation. From the American standpoint, we're fighting to contain the dominoes. We're fighting to contain communism, communist aggression. From the Vietnamese side of it, we want our independence and we want all foreigners gone. So which is the narrative that prevails? And for America at that time, the prevailing view was we need to fight the communist. But what happens is that the Vietnamese are determined they're going to get the French out. By the way, I want to mention, people have said sometimes that when I show multiple clips, it's sometimes covering the same ground. If clip number one covers topic A, clip number two covers topic A. I do that purposefully because I want, these are different documentaries, and I want you to hear it coming from different sources.
In Korea, 3 years of combat end as United Nations and communist negotiators at Panmunjom sign a truce.
In July of 1953, the Korean War ended in a negotiated settlement and a still divided peninsula. American policymakers saw it as proof that communism in Asia could be contained.
And in Washington, a dramatic evening press
That fall, the French indicated their willingness to begin talks to end the fighting in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh agreed to meet. But before the negotiators were to convene in Geneva, each side sought to improve its position on the battlefield. General Navarre set up a fortified base in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu, where he hoped to lure the Viet Minh into a decisive battle. Navarre was certain that superior French firepower and air support would crush any attack by the Viet Minh. He and his commanders saw no need to worry about the jungle-covered hills that overlooked his 11,000 men dug in on the valley floor. The artillery commander was so confident of victory, he complained, "I have more guns than I need." General Giap saw his chance. "We decided to wipe out at all costs the whole enemy force at Dien Bien Phu," he remembered. To do it, he pulled off one of the greatest logistical feats in military history, a feat that would be restaged in propaganda films and celebrated for decades. 250,000 civilian porters, nearly half of them women, moved everything he needed for a siege, from sacks of rice to disassembled artillery pieces, on foot through the jungle. Giap surrounded the valley with 50,000 soldiers and 200 big guns, dug in and camouflaged so well they could not be spotted from the air. On March 13, 1954, Viet Minh artillery on the hillsides began raining down 50 shells a minute on the French troops huddled below. The airstrip was destroyed. The besieged troops could only be reinforced and resupplied by airdrop. The French artillery commander, who had underestimated his enemy, committed suicide.
The airlift of Dien Bien Phu continues. Vital men and supplies for the heroic garrison that has defied the massed Viet Minh onslaughts for over 6 weeks. Today, Dien Bien Phu is a human dam trying to stem the red tide that threatens to engulf Southeast Asia.
The French government begged President Eisenhower to intervene. He refused to act without congressional approval and support from European allies. Britain said no, and the Congress would not support unilateral action.
The communists under Ho Chi Minh are able to claim that they are fighting for independence, and the French appear to be fighting for a maintenance of colonial rule. I therefore believe that before the United States moves in any degree, that independence must be granted to the people, that the people must support the struggle.
I am convinced, Eisenhower confided to his diary, that no military victory is possible in this theater. Still, without consulting Congress, the president had secretly sent more American transport planes. Their markings painted over and flown by civilian contractors to help resupply the desperate French troops at Dien Bien Phu.
Everyone understood that in and of itself, Vietnam didn't mean very much. But they believed, I believed, if we lost it, that the rest of Asia would tumble to communism.
You have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up, and you knock over the first one, and What will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly.
On the afternoon of May 7th, 1954, after 55 days of siege, the exhausted French forces at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. They had lost 8,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. General Giap had lost 3 times as many, but he had won a great victory.
Giải phóng nửa đất nước bởi một cuộc chiến tranh Điện Biên Phủ, tiêu diệt một tập đoàn của thực dân Pháp, đem một lòng tin vô hạn đối với nhân dân và đội chúng tôi, tin rằng thắng, nhất định thắng.
Even Zhuang Van Mai's parents could not help but be impressed.
They were very proud that the Vietnamese had defeated the French, this great Western power. Admiration and respect on the one hand, but fear on the other hand, and fear was a stronger emotion.
We have been caught bluffing by our enemies, Senate Minority Leader Lyndon Johnson said. Today it is Indochina. Tomorrow, Asia may be in flames. And the day after, the Western Alliance will lie in ruins.
We should have seen it as the end of the colonial era in Southeast Asia, which it really was. But instead, we saw it in Cold War terms, and we saw it as a defeat for the free world that was related to the rise of China, and it was a total misreading of a pivotal event, which cost us very dearly.
Stop that share. Okay, so here's the thing: when you are making a projection of what's going to happen in the future, it's important to understand that is a theory. It is not a fact. It is a theory, and an analyst, that is what I would do. I would say, here's what's going on. Here are the facts as we know them. Here's what is real. Here's what I think it's going to mean for the future. And it's important as an analyst is to say, here's what I think is going to happen in the future based on that evidence that I've provided and what I actually think, not based on what I'd like to see happen in the future. But this is what I think is going to happen in the future. So, but it's important to understand that the domino theory is just that. It is a theory. Now, it's important also to add that by the time of Dien Bien Phu, America is financing 80% of the French effort in Vietnam. And even with that support, however, France was destined to lose. There was a revolving door of top commanders. Then came General Navarre. Navarre decided to set up a command post in northern Vietnam. He decided to locate it in a basin within a mountainous terrain. You're going to set up your base camp in the basin with a mountainous terrain. This is never a good idea. Never set yourself on the low ground while leaving the high ground for your adversary to set up and then shoot you in a fishbowl. And that's what Giap recognized was an opportunity, and he took advantage of it. And by the way, moving those weapons up those mountains is way beyond human capacity. How they did it, I have no idea. I've been in those mountains. I'm sure I could not have done what they did. It is enormous. Now, Harry Truman's out of office. Dwight Eisenhower is in office at the time of Dien Bien Phu. And understand what was under serious consideration was using a nuclear bomb to save the French. At Dien Bien Phu, there were contingencies in place to use nuclear weaponry to try to save the French. Eisenhower, however, had General Matthew Ridgway, who had turned the tide in Korea and at least got to a point where there was an armistice. Ike calls on Ridgway to go and assess the situation in Vietnam with the French on the ropes and about to fall. So Ridgway goes and conducts a feasibility study about introducing American broader support to save the French. What Ridgway comes away with is he says, it'll take 500,000 men. It'll take us at least 10 years. And in the end, I don't know what we would have gained. And so, the French are crushed in Dien Bien Phu. A new government in France was determined to get out of Vietnam, but America had flexed its muscles, and now it pushes to have this conference in Geneva proceed only as a peace conference. Now I want you to see Dien Bien Phu from the standpoint of another documentary.
The French planned to test their new strategy in a valley set among the western mountains, 170 miles from Hanoi, Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh had passed through the valley during a major attack on Laos. The French expected another attack and thought Dien Bien Phu would be the place to engage them. In November 1953, 12,000 French troops began dropping into the valley under the command of Colonel Christian de Castro. The top French command in Saigon was sure that Giap would never be able to mass enough troops around Dien Bien Phu, never get heavy artillery up the hills, never keep supply lines open. The command at Dien Bien Phu was equally confident. The artillery officer insisted that no Viet Minh gun would be able to fire more than 3 rounds.
I saw all sorts of civilian and military authorities go through Dien Bien Phu. Unless my memory is completely twisted, I don't remember a single one. Absolutely not a single one of these authorities who didn't find that Dien Bien Phu was a formidable base. It was the great land and air base. It was untakeable.
The Viet Minh saw Dien Bien Phu as a great opportunity, but a great gamble, too. Ho Chi Minh's forces had lost heavily in attacks on other French strongpoints, but they decided to take the risk.
From Tay Nguyen, it took us about 45 days. We marched at night and rested during the day. Sometimes we just slept on the roadsides if there were no shelters around.
The French command was inviting a battle because they thought the Viet Minh would never be able to get enough troops and guns to Dien Bien Phu. But they did. 51,000 Viet Minh soldiers, 4 times the number of French troops, crossed the mountains carrying supplies on their backs and bicycles and hauling guns. Both sides had a special reason for wanting to win at Dien Bien Phu. At this same time, January 1954, the great powers were meeting in Berlin. They set a date and place, April 26th in Geneva, to meet and discuss Asian issues, including the Indochina crisis. On March 13th, Giap launched his attack on Dien Bien Phu. The battle began with massive human wave assaults. The Viet Minh guns blanketed French artillery from positions so well dug in and camouflaged that the French planes could not get at them. The first post fell within 8 hours. By the next day, March 14th, the Viet Minh shelling had destroyed the main airstrip. The French command staff was shocked. Colonel de Cast became withdrawn, uncommunicative. On the second night, the artillery commander committed suicide, saying, "I am completely dishonored." The commander
Get this.
victory at Dien Bien Phu cost.
Okay, so just another documentary production about the battle at Dien Bien Phu that I thought you might find useful. And so what you have is now the fight is over, and China and Russia are afraid that America is going to introduce, going to become involved in this fight, and they're now going to have the next great battle that they don't want to have. And so they pressure the Vietnamese to attend the meeting at Geneva to come to some kind of a peace agreement.
The former home of the League of Nations, Geneva, Switzerland, where East is meeting West in the international conference that may decisively affect the political future of Asia. Already ringed.
The day after the fall of Dien Bien Phu, diplomats from 9 nations gathered in Geneva to settle the future of Vietnam. The talks dragged on for nearly 2.5 months. Despite their victory, Ho Chi Minh and General Giap could not keep fighting without more support from China and the Soviet Union. But China had lost 1 million men in Korea and did not want to become involved in another war along its border. The Soviet Union was hoping to ease tensions with the West. Both of Ho Chi Minh's communist patrons urged him to agree to a negotiated settlement, a partition like the one that had ended the Korean War. Ho had no option but to give in. In the end, no one was satisfied. Vietnam was temporarily to be divided at the 17th parallel. The 130,000 French-led troops stationed in the north were to withdraw to the south, and somewhere between 50 and 90,000 Viet Minh were to regroup to the north. The two halves would be separated by a demilitarized zone until an election could be held to reunify North and South Vietnam. An election everyone knew Ho Chi Minh would win.
Again, mind you, we are fighting for democracy. We know that Ho Chi Minh is going to win. Ho Chi Minh is accepting another 2-year interlude until there can be free elections to decide who will take control over a unified country. We know Ho Chi Minh will win that election, but it gives 2 years. It placates the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans, and so that's what they agree to do. Ho Chi Minh, in this process, loses power. He remains the figurehead. Li Duan becomes the power. America is unaware of any of that until long after the war. I want you to see this Geneva conference again from another documentary.
Them even more. 8,000 dead, 15,000 wounded.
You are all aware that the French and their Vietnam ally have suffered reverses, notably the fall of Dien Bien Phu after a superb defense. The present situation is grave, but by no means hopeless.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to emphasize, John Foster Dulles is talking about the French having a superb defense. Everything about the Vietnam War said by officials was a lie, lie, lie.
In the present conference at Geneva, we and other free nations are seeking a formula by which the fighting can be ended and the people of Indochina assured true independence. So far, the communist attitude at Geneva is not encouraging.
The Geneva Conference bogged down almost immediately. The United States delegation was ordered to watch and not to talk.
My instructions were to go to the meetings, to not participate in them, and not to agree to anything, but to be there and sit at the table. And I found it a very difficult job to sit at the table at which people were making discussions, and some conclusions were being arrived at without agreeing to them, in situations in which silence itself tends to give assent. I can tell you that I was very, very unhappy and perspired very, very freely.
Emperor Bao Dai, head of the state of Vietnam, also sent a delegation to Geneva.
I was told I should accept the communists at the conference table. I said, no, there is only one Vietnamese state. It is I. The communists are rebels. Given my uncompromising position, they turned the political conference into a military conference.
In June, the French cabinet fell, and a new prime minister took over, a critic of the war, Pierre Mendès France. Mendès France made a promise to the French National Assembly. If he could not resolve the Indochina question at Geneva within 30 days, he would resign. The United States feared this meant France might abandon Indochina to the communists.
Washington was not at all clear as to what kind of an agreement Mendès France was proposing to make, or what agreement he would make. And if the agreement was going to be something with which we could possibly live or acquiesce, or whether or not we were going to have to denounce it and, in fact, walk out of the conference.
After much secret maneuvering, 1 week before his deadline, Mendès France got all the participants in place in Geneva. On July 20th, the day before the deadline, 2 issues were still unresolved.
At the conference, there were 2 issues under discussion. One was the temporary demarcation line between the 2 regions. And the other was the date of the general elections for the reunification of Vietnam. These 2 issues were closely connected. That was very clear.
The Viet Minh, flush with their victory at Dien Bien Phu, took a hard line on both issues. But on the last day, the Soviets and the Chinese forced them to compromise. The Viet Minh, who controlled most of the country, would get less than half. The elections to reunify Vietnam would take place not soon, when the Viet Minh would surely win, but in 2 years. They had been undercut by their own allies. The Soviets and Chinese had several motives, among them fear. If Mendès France failed, France might keep fighting, and America might intervene.
La raison et la paix
Reason and peace have won out. After days and nights of hard negotiations, filled with anxiety and hope, the ceasefire has been signed. In my soul and my conscience, I am sure these are the best conditions we could have hoped for in the present state of things.
My own feeling at the end of the conference was that we had probably obtained just about all that could be obtained in the light of the situation on the ground. I don't think we could have obtained much more. But I must say that very honestly, I didn't have not have much optimism that South Vietnam was going to be able to survive.
Again, I want to just re-emphasize that the French invaded in 1858. The French were defeated on the battlefield in 1954. China, Russia, and America all seem to think that it's up to them to decide what will happen in Vietnam. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's time for the French to get the hell out and let the Vietnamese run their country. You know, I played a clip of Robert McNamara meeting with his Vietnamese counterpart 20 years after the war to try to discern, where did we go wrong? What could we have done to avoid all of this killing and all of the destruction that took place? And Robert McNamara says, you know, you didn't gain anything through all of that fight. We would have given you everything you wanted, as if it was for America to give them, to give. How did that become your authority? He also, when they were organizing that conference in 1995, Robert McNamara, they would discuss what they were going to, what period they would cover. And McNamara wanted to go back to the beginning of the Kennedy administration. And the Vietnamese said, no, you got to go back much farther than that. And they bring it back to the World War. But actually, they should have brought it back to 1858. And then when they do widen the frame, and there's a lot more evidence there to make America really look bad. This was, what were you doing here? Why were you doing the stuff you were doing? Why don't you just leave the colonialism was the cause of the world wars. Why are you in there trying to put a colonial power back in power? McNamara turns it around and he says, he blames the Vietnamese. You should have told us because we were so ignorant. You should have told us. Okay, let me close with my poem for the day. This is by Jan Barry, titled The Longest War. The longest war is over, or so they say, again. But I can still hear the gunfire every night from my bed. The longest nightmare never seems to ever quite come to an end. Okay, with that, we can have discussion, comments.
Yeah, everyone, you can turn on your video again and use the raise the hand feature to ask questions or make comments. I see that we have Howard/Tim here. If you can unmute.
Yes. So that one American diplomat or a political figure in the U.S. said that we totally misjudged Vietnam and the French involvement. And then we totally misjudged overthrowing a democratically elected government in Iran. We totally misjudged what we could do in Afghanistan after 20 years of a country that had never been colonized. We made a misjudgment when we overthrew a dictator in Iraq, disbanded and neglected an existing military and an existing political system that could have run the country. When are we going to stop misjudging things and lying to the American people about, you know, weapons of mass destruction and communism is going to take over? And, you know, when are they going to stop doing that?
Well, you know, look, that is my my major flag that I wave, which is you need to do the historical research and not knee-jerk into wars and actually know what you're dealing with and what you're talking about. And really, it is it's an enormous frustration. I mean, in my career, that was it. I was constantly fighting those kinds of battles. And it was, what you get is there'll be some military event like 9/11 as an example. And the testosterone gets flowing and everyone wants to show how tough they are. And they want to quickly pick up the weapons and we're going to go and show them. And, you know, I come along and say, well, I think we need to do a historical study. And I mean, it's like, throw him out of here. I mean, I got to tell you, I've lived with a lot of contempt and disdain from people that I worked with. But eventually it would come back and they would be running down a quagmire, and the answer to all of those problems becomes, we just got to throw more muscle at it. We got to bomb them more. And when that continues to fail, that they then say, all right, what's going wrong here? Well, you read the history of it. I'm going to do a class on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and all of that in the fall, I think it is, or the winter, whatever. Anyway, when you look at it, people today still believe Osama bin Laden is a member of the Taliban. The Taliban hated him. They hated him. They wanted nothing to do with him. The only one who felt an obligation was Mullah Omar, because Osama helped them in a fight that we provoked with the Russians. I mean, it's just, there's facts. Let's deal with reality. And it's very hard for people to do that. You know, as an analyst, you have to make distinctions between the theory of what you think happened and your actual evidence. They're different things. And, you know, I still, what we did in Vietnam is what we did in Iraq, is what we did in Iran, is what we did in Afghanistan. We keep repeating the same. And again, you know, as I said before, the most dangerous chemical on the planet is testosterone. I mean, you know, the people, they got to show, you hit us, we're going to hit you back.
Uh-oh. You got muted somehow.
I just
wanted
to
no.
Thank
Okay.
you. That's all.
No, you're muted again now. Are you done, Tim? Yeah. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Nora.
Okay. Norm, if you could unmute yourself.
Bien Bien Phu was in 1954. The Battle of Algiers started in 1954. What kind of civil opposition was there in France? France was under a lot of stress.
Yeah,
I also
don't know. I don't know. That's a really good question, because Mendes France comes to power as being opposed to the wars. And so I assume there was a political movement to say, we got to stop these fights, because France is still recovering from World War II.
But also the
still recovering
Algerian
from
War.
World War I.
The Algerian War was more brutal than the Vietnamese War.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question. There's a couple of documentaries out about it too, and I've had a few on my radar screen to watch, but I haven't seen them yet. Yeah, really good point. Yeah.
So I think France almost didn't have a choice. They had to back out.
Right. Well, you got where they couldn't fund it anymore.
Right.
And America was funding the French effort in Vietnam for, the final, for, at least since 1950.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, when you look at the end of World War II, for Britain to continue its stuff in India, for France to continue its stuff in Algeria and in Vietnam, that was crazy. They needed to go and rebuild. The whole world is gutted. When we look at Russia, yes, Stalin was a brute. Everything was state-run. There wasn't any time to start pulling together industries and businesses that could somehow compete in the free market. They had no place to live. The Moscow in the winter is not a very pleasant place. So he is and you look at the stuff that the state builds. They have one hot water system for Moscow. Kiev has one hot water system. It serves all and they shut it down every year for maintenance. I was in Kiev when they shut down the water. I said, what? There's no hot water. We were there. It was really cold. And why is this? Well, because they were all so gutted. It was, we got to do things on a mass scale to get housing, people living as quickly as possible. And it's difficult for us to relate to that. But that was it. It was, their survival. Thanks, Norm. Yeah.
Seems to me that we just seem surprised, war after war after war after war, that the people that actually live there are going to fight so hard to retain their, their place there, and seem to resist having people come in and take them over. We seem to always be surprised by that.
The Vietnamese were tenacious, and I think they were extraordinary in their commitment to I'd rather die than be a slave, and that really was the choice.
I don't doubt that. Madeline, Madeline's back. And
hi. I
Good.
think that can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that is also partly due to going back once again to our racism and our racist past. I think that we had the people who were deciding what we do in these places, they didn't think the Vietnamese were going to be as capable as we were, or as the French. I mean, shoot, Dien Bien Phu happened in what, 1954? and still in the 60s, we weren't getting it. Look at what they did there. Look at what the Viet Minh did. And the French commander committed suicide after. I mean, we still just didn't get it. And I think part of that is this arrogance that we were superior. I really do think that's part of it.
And all, yeah, no, I agree. And it's, again, not really being willing to invest the time and effort to understand what exactly are we dealing with. You know, it's like the discussion, you know, in our last class about the Trump landscape, right? Tried to talk about the history going back deep into American history so you understand what you're up against. I asked the question before class, who has an interest in seeing kids killed in classrooms? If your objective is to end American democracy, then you have an interest in seeing kids killed in schools and the government be incapable of responding to it. Because then people get angry at the government and they become more malleable in ending American democracy. It's important to understand that. You got to Sun Tzu, I think, is it captures it the best, is understand your enemy and understand yourself. And we invest very little in both of them.
So, Sal, what's coming up next week?
Next week, we're going to get past Dien Bien Phu, and we're now going to see the government of Diem come to power, and how we, you know, we cast our lot with Diem and think, all right, we now have a leader that's going to, you know, get everything right. And we have in our mind that we can help establish a government in South Vietnam that will be able to resist the North and will eventually be able to form an army and fight and win the day, and that the South Vietnamese government will be the government of all of Vietnam. Remember that what I said about the Vietnamese had a animosity towards anyone who collaborated with the French. And in the end, we wind up being on the side of French collaborationists. We still don't understand that there was no possible way the South Vietnamese government was going to win and be representative. Yeah. So we're going to look at that next week.
While everyone is unmuting so they can give Sal a round of applause, I just want to remind everyone that it isn't next week, it is the week after, because next week we have spring break.
Right.
And thank you to Eileen for reminding me of that. But
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.
Yeah. And we'll see y'all.
Be careful on spring break too. No, none of that partying, you know, overindulgence in libations.
So everyone be safe out there, and thanks, and we'll see you after the break.